Hi, welcome to Watershed Moments, the video trilogy series. My name is David McKenzie. I am a member of the Watershed Moments team. Including our speakers, the team consists of 15 people representing 11 organizations. Producing the trilogy series has involved an amazing collaboration on the part of everyone. My roles in this collaborative effort have been as director, videographer, and editor. We begin today with the second video in the series. At the end of the video, we will go live with a question and answer period. During the video broadcast, email your questions at this address. The email link is below the video viewer on the waterbucket page you've been sent to attend this presentation. Again, that's questions at watersustainabilitybc, all one word, .ca. We will accept questions throughout the broadcast until the final 10 minutes or so. That will be the point at which the presentation team members summarize their takeaway messages. YouTube gives the option of pausing the video, so if necessary, you can exit the event without missing any portions of it. Now, as they say, let's get on with the show.
Hi, I'm Paul Chapman, the Executive Director of the Nanaimo and Area Land Trust and the Chair of the Vancouver Island Water Stewardship Symposia Series.
And I'm Kim Stevens, Executive Director, Partnership for Water Sustainability in British Columbia. And the Symposia Series is a program under the umbrella of the Georgia Basin Interregional Education Initiative.
Welcome to the second module in Watershed Moments, the video trilogy series. We are speaking to you today from the territory of the Nanaimo people. Last week we learned about interregional collaboration and actionable visions on the east coast of Vancouver Island. This week, the team of Tim Pringle and Emanuel Machado share their insights regarding natural assets as ecological systems and services. Tim, why will our audience be interested to hear from Tim and Emanuel?
Tim Pringle is the visionary driving EAP, the Ecological Accounting Process, and Emanuel Machado is the local government face for MNAI, the Municipal Natural Assets Initiative. EAP and MNAI represent recent points along the green infrastructure continuum. The two are the latest evolution in an ongoing process in British Columbia that had its genesis in the late 1980s and the early 1990s. From Tim and Emanuel, the audience will learn why and how natural assets support the delivery of core local government services while doing so much more.
Tim, you mentioned the green infrastructure continuum. How does this connect to water?
It's actually a very simple relationship, and this is an overarching message for this module. Water sustainability will be achieved by implementing green infrastructure policies and practices. In other words, what we do on the land matters for water. And we can do so much better by designing with nature rather than conquering nature. Think in terms of a cascading flow. Embrace a design with nature philosophy, implement green infrastructure policies and practices, and maintain balance in the water cycle.
So everything is connected?
Yes, Paul. Tim Pringle and Emanuel Machado are advocates for whole system thinking. Their efforts are helping local governments expand the scope of asset management beyond sewer, water, and roads to encompass ecological assets. The whole system approach to development, and I emphasize whole system, and getting it right, especially getting it right, is how communities will ultimately reconnect hydrology and ecology.
Both the Ecological Accounting Process and the Municipal Natural Asset Initiative identify and place value on the services we already extract from our creeks. Understanding the value and cost of business as usual can lead to a better stewardship as we put resources behind bolstering the healthy functioning of our creek sheds, restoring water balance and ecological function. as integral components to the municipal service delivery and asset management. The stewardship sector can provide insight to ongoing challenges, improvements, and changes over time, and can benefit from the municipal resources that can be dedicated to reconnecting hydrology with ecology.
Welcome. My name is Richard Bose. I'm here in Hunter Park in the District of North Vancouver alongside the bank of Hastings Creek. I'm very proud and happy to share this place with you, as it's a place that I've grown up and I've worked in for my entire life. I chose to work in local government over 25 years ago, in particular here in North Van District, because it's a special place and I thought I had something to offer to help make it better. Right now I work with the District of North Vancouver in their Environmental Protection Department. I've got a wonderful team of professionals that I work with on a daily basis. We deliver environmental education projects. We work with the local community group on stream restoration projects, even here in Hastings Creek. One of the things that makes me as happy as I can be is being outside, enjoying the environment and the natural surroundings here on the North Shore, whether it's on the ocean, up in the mountains, or just enjoying a walk through the park. I've been so fortunate to use my science background as a geoscientist to work with all kinds of people and projects here in the district. Collaboration with local streamkeepers, stakeholders and stewards, working with the technical requirements on engineering projects, and then having a chance to really look at innovative and forward-thinking policy around community services and natural assets like Hastings Creek and the kinds of service that this creek does for the community. We do know that we've got a large and steep hill ahead of us, and if we're going to be successful in building a more resilient community, it's going to take every member of the community to get together, to maybe do some things that you haven't done before, but it's only through cooperation and collaboration are we going to basically find the right solution and ideas to help build a resilient, comfortable, and enjoyable communities for a lot longer. The series was designed to produce technical information, give you background on some of the innovative collaboration happening around the district, and talk about some of the new and emerging trends in natural assets and community services municipalities provide. It's up to you to take whatever resonates with you from this series and choose what you want to do with it.
My name is Emanuel Machado, or Manny. I'm with the town of Gibsons, and I'm standing on Gospel Rock on the Sunshine Coast on the traditional territory of the Squamish Nation. I'm the Chief Administrative Officer and the Chief Resiliency Officer of the town of Gibsons, and with our staff team, we're responsible for the overall management of the town's assets on behalf of the community. Water has always been a fundamental part of my work in local government, and it goes back to growing up in the Azores, where our family was in the fishing industry, and then we had to walk to go and source our water, as in those days there was not a municipal service available to provide us like we have here today. Things we do take for granted. And our approach there is to think about insularity, self-sufficiency, and learn from very early on the importance of managing our food, our energy, and our water. Those ways of living has certainly influenced my work in local government. And fortunate for me, I'm in a position to work with the community and others to ensure the long-term sustainability of our water source. One of the outcomes I'd like to see from this gathering and this conference is that the communities on the Sunshine Coast and on Vancouver Island and beyond begin to adjust their planning at a watershed scale and ensuring the ecological integrity of the natural assets within it that we all depend on to function adequately as communities. Because our ultimate sustainability doesn't happen at our homes necessarily, or even in our neighborhood. It happens in an overall watershed scale.
Hello, my name is Tim Pringle. I live here on Salt Spring Island. I'm retired, and in retirement I've been involved with the Partnership for Water Sustainability in BC, and I manage a project called Ecological Accounting Process. I grew up on a farm near Spokane, Washington, and my favorite memory is coming in from the fields as a teenager in the evening and going for a swim in the river. So water has always been a fond relationship for me. Our family moved to Smithers, BC in 1963. I went to Vancouver to study at the University of British Columbia. I have a degree in sociology. 3 decades of my employment career involved work with grant-making foundations. 22 of those years were with the Real Estate Foundation of BC. When I started, I was the first executive director. I realized that the Real Estate Act talked about land and real estate, but not ecology or conservation. I got the Board of Governors after 2 years to adopt the philosophy that use and conservation of land are equal values. My years with the Real Estate Foundation provided me an opportunity to interact with many nonprofit organizations, local government personnel, businesses, and others, people committed to wise use of our land and ecological resources. The passion of these groups, especially the stream keepers and land trust people, inspired me. I appreciated their knowledge and their expertise, and that passion is what keeps me going in the volunteer work I do now. One of the things that I would like to see come out of the conference or this conversation is that people interested or concerned about our ecological systems and how they may be protected will see that there's a lot of expertise and commitment among people who are working now. There's a lot that's positive. There's a great deal to be done. And I go back to my basic philosophy that use and conservation of land are equal values. We need to measure and manage that.
We are looking at a whole system. The natural and built environments are interconnected. Without an ecological system, there are no ecological services.
2 programs, the MNAI, the Municipal Natural Assets Initiative, and the EAP, the Ecological Accounting Process, are facilitating the move from awareness to action that accounts for ecological systems and services. What do you know about the EAP and the MNAI missions? Do you wonder whether they are the same or are they different? The 2 initiatives are outcomes flowing from the tireless determination of 2 pioneers, EAP Chair Tim Pringle and the MNAI Chair Emanuel Machado, to transform how local governments view ecological systems and the services they provide. Development of both the MNAI and the EAP began around 2015. Actually translating policy objectives into tangible outcomes requires that local governments have a methodology and metrics for valuing ecological assets and the services in an asset management strategy and framework. Emanuel Machado changed local government conversation in BC. His philosophy and local government credibility continues to generate momentum for replicating the town of Gibson's model in other communities and local governments. For 3 decades, Tim Pringle has worked hard to develop and evolve a guiding philosophy, pragmatic strategy, and meaningful metrics for valuing the services provided by nature, and for establishing budgets for maintenance and management of watersheds. Once you have a number for better maintenance and management of ecological assets, what do you do with that number? Putting it into play requires an understanding of how local government processes work. So, Tim, your process in terms of the ecological accounting protocol identifies this area that you've termed a natural commons, or natural commons. Talk a little bit about how you've developed the term, what it means, and how it's so important to the EAP process.
Well, I think philosophically, several things led me to the concept. One is our communities share a landscape with nature. That's unavoidable. There's interdependence, but what's the nature of that interdependence? And for me, that's like a social contract when you think about natural assets. People expect to have them available. They think someone is, or somehow they're being managed and maintained, and that they'll be there in the future. So that expectation, that social contract, implies that the actors involved, whether they're private owners or the local government, stewardship community, are somehow involved in the streams or natural assets. What is their involvement? That's what we're trying to understand. And in terms of managing and maintaining, what actually happens on the landscape with our natural assets. So we're trying to define that as a natural commons, the implied contract about people maintaining those services, and what they do for our communities.
The process really uses natural commons significantly. So tell us a little bit more in detail a bit about what a natural commons is. Is it a sidewalk that you've got a family walking down the road on their way to school? Is it something different? How and why is your definition in the process of a natural commons so different from what people would even venture to think about it?
I think you can compare it to our familiar concepts about a constructed commons, drainage systems, roads, whatever they are, delivery of potable water. People expect those to be available. We also have institutional commons, schools and parks and other features of the community that people use and enjoy. In the same way, a natural commons is used and enjoyed by the community, and to the extent that it's recognized, it probably has higher use. To the extent that it's not recognized, it may be overlooked.
So my example of a sidewalk would be a constructed commons.
Yes.
And a natural commons would be, say, for example, that the forest that you might have a nice trail through it that is in a park, say? Is that an accurate comparison?
Sure. There are lots of uses of the ecological services that a natural commons provides. I mean, it could be an urban woodland. It could be a stream. Streams are often alignments for trails, greenways. People are interested in the fish that may be in the stream, the habitat around the stream that provides access to see wildlife, and so on. There's a lot of the natural appreciation available, but as well there's the things we don't see. Using a stream for conveyance of stormwater from the urban drainage system, recharging our aquifers, supplying wells, all of those things.
Manny, you've been 8 years with the town of Gibson's, the chair of the Municipal Natural Asset Initiative for, I think, a number of years as well. The idea of promoting more use of these natural assets in the local government setting is relatively new. So tell us a little bit about, what is a natural asset, say, from a local government setting, and why is it so important?
In the context of Gibson's, a natural asset is a feature in the natural environment that provides a municipal-like service. Going back to 2012, we were trying to understand how much water we had available for the community, but also the quality of that water. And through that, ask the question, how dependent are we on nature to continue to provide these types of services to our residents? And the answer is not that we're just really dependent, we're totally dependent. our infrastructure is interconnected and interdependent on nature to function adequately. And simply having pumps and pipes alone doesn't deliver water to folks. And we're trying to move away from simply managing individual assets and manage ecosystem services, these natural assets within the community itself.
So the water and the water supply that provides potable water in the town of Gibsons is a natural asset, and maybe describe some of the challenges and why you have decided that taking this new outlook on that water has become so critical to the town of Gibsons. What led you to say we needed to do something different now in terms of the water?
We were concerned about the state of infrastructure. We're noticing that our infrastructure that was built in the 40s, 50s, and 60s is decaying at a faster rate than we can afford to replace it. Nature itself is overused, undervalued, and underpriced. And nature knows no boundaries. So we're still, for the most part, operating communities on jurisdictional boundaries that don't recognize the natural ecosystems that are on the land. Moreover, for us, we realized that we didn't have so much of a manual to proceed on that basis. But what we do know is that it requires asset management, financial planning, and ecology. And it's principles of these areas that we've been relying upon to create a revised practice that we call natural asset management. And it's been a very good fit for a community like Gibsons that still operates roughly with the same elements that we had before, but have been able to reduce operational and capital costs. We have been able to reduce our risk exposure from failure of these assets and feel more comfortable now and going forward about our ability to withstand the impacts of climate change.
That's great. You gave me a great quote that I want to probe a little bit with you both on. You just said nature is overused, undervalued, and there was a third one: overused, undervalued,
And
underpriced. So that speaks to almost the base philosophy of both of the new groundbreaking work you're both doing. So Tom, tell me, or Tim, explain how the quote we just got from Manny, how does the ecological accounting process seek to help us address those three issues around nature and natural assets?
I think philosophically, I've long had the belief that use and conservation of land are equal values. And within that value set, as I mentioned earlier, there are social, ecological, and financial aspects to that. When we talk about nature being overused, an example for me would be a lot of our land use has provided settlement change and development, and the ecological aspects are kind of a leftover. So they haven't been part of the strategy for that development often. That is changing. But that legacy of having left the ecological services to the end of the process and then trying to restore them or fix them, that's a poor return on the investment. The investment's already there in the form of nature. It's a very poor return when you trash it, so to speak, or alter it so it doesn't function properly, and then you go back to try to fix it. An example would be Brooklyn Creek in the town of Comox. About 11 years ago, there was flooding that caused severe erosion, and the town spent $2 million putting a bypass pipe connected to the creek to take water directly to the harbor. That was the top 20% of flows. They realized that in the future they couldn't afford to keep doing that kind of engineering solution. So they adopted a 10-year strategy to enhance the creek. So they wanted to manage the creek, and they wanted to do it through enhancement. They got involvement of the 3 departments in the local government: Parks, Planning, and Public Works, involvement of the stream keepers, and each year they carried out enhancement work. As that went on, the community saw the work being done. They got interested because it was enhancing parks, it was extending greenways, adding trails, and people saw the value of having those amenities in their community. So at the end of their process, the town realized that when they moved to annex a new area for development, which they're now doing, they would approach the planning differently than traditionally. And the difference is they looked at the natural assets in the creek shed, especially the areas that could intercept, detain, and infiltrate rainwater, and leave those areas intact. Then set out their community design, put their key institutional uses in, and then do the drainage at the end, rather than the reverse process which used to occur.
So you said that the people saw the value in doing things a little differently. How did they see the value, and what value did they now see that they weren't able to visualize before? What was the value that they now saw?
I think it was straightforward. They saw the stewardship community, the volunteers working with local government. There were some businesses involved. They saw, for example, a section of the creek being changed from a swale along a schoolyard or school property, putting in the winding of the stream again, putting in the riparian area, making sure that area could host salmon spawning. And the community sees the work going on. They talk to their councillors and say, what a great job to be doing this. And so the values are, they're primarily social at first, but they translate into economic values because the maintenance of the stream, the onus of maintaining the stream is reduced by doing these ecological improvements.
Right. So it's what makes it such a difficult subject, right? The community sees some perceived value through the aesthetics of making a change. And it's intuitive. People would like to look at a nice meandering stream with riparian vegetation that's lush and healthy. But in order to do more of that, you had to convince the local government that, hey, if we do this, we can help you save money in the long term, right? So it talks to how difficult this is when the real driver came from how something looked. Now, Manny, I want to come back to you. How about an example of a particular natural asset that you've been working on with your team at Gibson's in terms of how and which ways did you look at giving that asset value, helping to restore it so it's not overused, and a bit of an example so that how we might see specifically how you're looking at making these changes?
Certainly. I think it's important we take a couple of steps back there to answer that question. What happened in Gibson's, it's not that we're different than other communities, is that we've formally recognized nature as our most valuable infrastructure asset. And simply making that statement without following up is not sufficient to protect these areas going forward. The next thing that followed was a recognition in our financial statements that we had not only a dependency on these areas to provide services, but that we also required a management approach to ensure its continuity. So we went to council as staff and asked them to do that through an updated asset management policy that directed us to incorporate natural asset considerations into our financial planning, into our land use planning, but also in council's decision making. And shortly after that, our first opportunity arose when we were contemplating through our capital works program to upgrade a stormwater asset to convey water from Upper to Lower Gibsons. and a natural area nearby was already participating in that service. Now that we had a policy, it required us to consider the role of nature in that service. And when we did that, we realized that there was no tool to do that just yet, and hence the Natural Assets Initiative partnership that we reached out to the David Suzuki Foundation and to Smart Prosperity Institute and asked them if they could help us develop a tool that would, in essence, provide a comparable business case for nature or natural asset that we could show council whether it made sense to build that larger pipe option or restore the natural area. And what we discovered with this area called White Tower Park was already doing a lot more work than we thought, and with a bit more enhancement we could provide not only the same level of service, we could also protect the community from the impact of climate change in the future. And we could do all that for about 25 cents on the dollar. And that's very significant because for a community like Gibson's, the original project was looking at around $4.5 million with nearly $100,000 a year in operations and maintenance. The natural area, once restored and improved, will do that for under $1 million with a fraction of the costs in operations and maintenance. It was a relatively easy decision for council to make, but they had, by that time, had the policy in place and had the direction to staff, and that encouraged us to then pursue other assets as well. And we're currently in the process of extending that type of assessment and valuation to the rest of the watershed and ultimately to our coastal areas as well. By the end of 2021, we intend to have a detailed assessment of all areas within the Gibson's watershed, and that's where we're heading.
Wow, so that's a pretty bold step for staff to convince council to make a policy decision that says we'll consider natural assets in our capital program without knowing exactly how they're going to evaluate or do that. So congratulations.
Yeah, thank you.
So we've heard from Manny and Tim around how the ecological accounting process and the municipal natural asset initiatives are helping local governments, communities understand the value of these natural assets. What we're going to do now is we're going to talk in a little bit more detail around how some of these assets are actually evaluated through these two different and very leading edge progressive philosophies being developed. Tim, tell us a little bit about how you actually value a watershed through the ecological accounting process.
There are two processes that the ecological accounting process uses. One is looking at the worth of the natural asset, the stream, and what has the community invested in it. And Manny and I were talking about this earlier, that communities often don't record information about what they're spending in relation to natural assets. So if you add up the work of stream keepers, the investment by parks in maintaining areas around a stream, what is spent by public works to make sure the conveyance systems are working in connection with drainage, fixing dangerous trees and whatever, that adds up over a decade to quite a lot of investment. Do we know what that is? And when you look at it, when you get the number, sometimes it's quite surprising. The second part of what we do is we look at the value of the land that is occupied by the stream. So the concept here is that a stream is a land use. It's a land use because it's defined in regulation and it has area. If we take the value of parcels that abut or adjoin the stream, and look at the portion of those parcels that are within the setback zone, which is that regulated area that's to protect the stream, its functioning condition. We can determine through a process we use what the value of that area occupied by the stream, including the setback zone, is. It has a real value. We use BC assessment data for parcel values to do that. And then we express that value in terms of value per meter square or per lineal meter for some segment of a stream, or it could be the entire stream. It's a way of saying to the community, this is a real asset. It does have a capital value. If you know what that capital value is, you can look at a rule of thumb for maintenance, say 1% of value. You should spend at least that as a community annually to maintain and manage the stream. So that's kind of the framework of our evaluation through ecological accounting process.
So summarizing it basically for me briefly is you look at the value of work spent on the watershed, and then you look at the actual value of the parceled land in which the watershed runs through. And then you're developing a formula that inputs that value in terms of dollars, is that correct?
Yes.
And then all of that helps you identify the value of that watershed.
Yeah, it gives a working number. This is not the sort of number you would put into financial statements. This is a number you would use for planning budgets and asset management strategies. But currently, local government doesn't have that number. It doesn't exist.
You mentioned something that I want to just briefly highlight, and then I want to talk in more detail about local government infrastructure. You mentioned the value of work that the stream keepers and other stakeholder groups are doing. And I want to touch briefly on this because this is, not only is this important and brand new and innovative, but I know a lot of people out in our audience are stakeholders and steward groups. So I want to just emphasize the importance of this work you're now doing, in that there's value in all of this work. This is no longer a pursuit of pastimes or hobbies. This is actual important work that should be coming in front of your local government and help to determine the various aspects of operations planning, capital planning, and all of that. So again, what we're seeing again is just one of the very new and innovative ways that the two leaders here are pioneering new work, in that we're actually finding a way to use this tireless work put in by the stakeholders and various community groups that work on these watersheds in the actual valuations of the worth of these really important assets. Manny, so what I'd like to have you elaborate briefly on is how and what kind of a framework or methodology has Gibson's used in terms of, you talked a bit about a storm sewer pipe and a replacement project. So speak a bit about how you valued that particular asset in terms of this natural asset lens.
Let me start by saying that for the number matters less than the recognition that the asset has value. It's a bit like exercising. It doesn't matter what equipment you use as long as you're being active. And in that sense, our process is a little bit different than the EAP, but nevertheless, it has similar objectives. At the time that we wanted to do the valuation for White Tower Park, such a methodology wasn't available yet for local government. And the partners that we work with, the SF and the Smart Prosperity Institute, rely on working with us, sort of develop a new methodology that it starts by doing a biophysical assessment of the area and then a socioeconomic analysis of the value of those services. So the biophysical assessments uses LiDAR information, but also a methodology like EPA SWIM or other. And once you have that basic condition assessment of the area, then what will translate is the condition of the area, but also the service capacity. How much stormwater conveyance can that area produce, or how much drinking water can it be stored? There's a methodology that comes from Stanford University called INVEST, and those tools pair very well with the condition assessment, and it's a bit like an RS means for nature that allows you to attribute a value to the service that's associated with it. And so that told us not only that the area had tremendous capacity, it told us about the comparative value of those services, but we also got information about how to adjust our practices to maintain those assets going forward. In our case, our motivation was sort of the eminence decision about a pretty expensive project and the need to at least check if there was an alternative. But one can go about doing evaluation for other reasons as well, including our need to report on the value of our infrastructure and the depreciation of our infrastructure as well. There's the question of understanding how much money should you be spending every year to maintain the area going forward, so it helps with our operational plans as well. You could also do evaluation if you want to understand your risk exposure, be it from an asset failure or reduction in service, or to try and understand the capacity of that asset to protect the community over climate change different scenarios. So that's sort of the motivation behind it, and that process that I described, the biophysical assessment and the socioeconomic analysis, has been refined, and it's what's been replicated by the Municipal Natural Assets Initiative, which is a non-for-profit organization that the town helped to found a few years back, and the learnings from Gibson's is what we share with other communities as well.
So it's very interesting, and I think you both touched on how difficult it is to value a natural asset using various methods. And you've also both agreed on what I think is the really important point in this whole subject is despite how difficult it is to get everyone to agree on a formula for replacing a storm sewer or the value of a watershed, both of you said the same thing, in that it's more important to recognize that there is some value of this natural asset, because once, as a broader society, we can understand that there is this thing called a natural asset or a value that nature provides, then we can influence decision making and choice around doing things slightly different. So we touched on it briefly, and I want to start with you, Manny. How was the notion of this, there's social well-being, community, healthy well-being, the feeling that one gets in walking beside a healthy stream or a nice wetland, how do we manage to include that kind of feeling in your process?
Certainly. We're a local government providing basic services to residents. And in the context of our discussions, we're primarily talking in that language. But of course, we recognize that the area that we're protecting for aquifer recharge or for stormwater conveyance, as many other services, including pollination and habitat, and of course well-being. Whether you're protecting it for stormwater services or for the community's well-being or for habitat, in any of those cases it requires a structured asset management approach in a financial plan, and that supports that asset, because in itself, if you want to maintain those areas in perpetuity, it requires support. And that's in essence what's been missing from our conversation. I think the intention and the intent on understanding these values and these assets has probably been there for some time, but we haven't until recently been able to develop a methodology that we could use, and we're there now.
Tim, you mentioned in some of your earlier discussions around the EAP, the community saw the value. And you also mentioned that some of the framework around the valuation process used in the EAP uses parcel value and land value. Do you think in some way that your process includes this social outlook in terms of the value of the land, given that the value of the land, you would think intuitively, would be higher in an area where people feel better because of the healthy watershed? Do you think that's true?
I'm not sure you could attach value to the amount of well-being that people perceive around a natural asset. But going back to the concept of the natural commons, the elements there are residents and property owners have equal access to this natural commons and the ecological services it provides. When you try to value that from the point of view of parcels along the stream, if you carry that concept of shared responsibility or shared access, then a property owner who abuts a stream, and all property owners along the stream for its length, have an obligation not to do harm. So that's a principle that tells us that the social values include how people perceive the stream and what they do around the stream within the regulation or beyond the regulation. And our valuation process, where we're looking at parcel values and determining what we call the natural commons asset value, we reach a number, and that number represents a shared amount for the parcel owner and a shared amount for the community. It implies a social contract. No harm will be done, hopefully, and maintenance and management responsibilities will be shared. So from a local government strategy point of view, if they have an EAP valuation and it says the stream is worth $5,000 a meter, whatever that number is, it implies also that property owners will cooperate on maintenance and the local government will take steps to maintain the property, including those areas that are owned privately. Now, we're a long way from making that work well, but that's the direction it should go.
So you mentioned something else really important that I want to just touch on briefly. You mentioned this concept of not doing harm or creating a lesser value of this resource or asset. To me, it's again another really important part that the steward groups and community groups will play, because typically local governments have relied on the stewardship groups to repair harm, do outreach and all of that. But now we're saying that this is so important in this asset that these stewardship groups and all of that outreach they have been doing should be transferred and become part of everyday operating protocols for local governments. We've heard a lot about the valuation of natural assets from a local government perspective, specific examples from the town of Gibsons. We've heard Tim talk about the ecological accounting process in terms of valuing the worth of some of these watersheds that they've worked on. Brooklyn Creek, I think, was mentioned. I got to play a little devil's advocate here, and being also from a local government, I know there's already lots of legislation around the protection of natural assets like streams and wetlands, species at risk. I'm going to ask both of you, in your own specific perspectives, why don't you think that legislation is enough to protect these natural assets? If it's not enough, why? And maybe in turns, you might be able to add some ideas on how or what kind of changes you might want to see. So why don't we start with you, Manny? Local governments, we're subject to ensuring that we're compliant with federal and provincial legislation, the Fisheries Act, the riparian areas regulation, that all afford protection around natural assets. Is that enough? If not, why? And give us sort of some of your thoughts and feelings around those regulations and natural assets.
Certainly, I don't believe that's enough. We certainly got the requirements and some responsibility, but got very few tools to do that work. In general, I think we have two issues to address. One is the issue of scale, and the other is the issue of governance. As I mentioned earlier, nature itself knows no boundaries, and if you think about a cubic meter of water that travels from the top of Mount Elphinstone in Gibsons to the Gibsons Harbor, it travels through 10 different agencies with various policy areas associated with it, and nearly all of them affect how that cubic meter of rainwater makes it to the ocean. And so the town of Gibsons is a minor player in that discussion. That is one of the reasons that we have proposed a different governance, because I believe that for local governments to do their job responsibly, we need more permissions to work at a watershed scale itself. And our proposal that we're working with our neighboring communities on the Sunshine Coast envisions, as you mentioned, recognition of citizen science and the role that they play. Of course, indigenous knowledge is a fundamental part of that, but introduces the co-management of natural areas, of ecosystem services within the watershed itself. Today, we don't have that. We have independent agencies that are managing primarily just their own focus areas, irrespective of what happens around that. And that is, I think, what we need to address.
Tim, the ecological accounting process, again, uses a methodology to value the worth of a stream or a watershed corridor. Those corridors are in effect mainly determined by setbacks, which are then determined and governed under provincial regulations. Do you think those regulations are important enough, or do they provide enough protection to afford the kind of value that a watershed needs to provide the community services needed?
Not an easy question to answer.
That's why I gave it to you.
Well, first of all, the Streamside Protection Act came into force in the early 2000s. A lot of our settlement development took place before that time. If you look at the setback area along a stream, you get a riparian zone, but the stream was a riparian ecosystem, which is quite a different kind of asset. So a riparian ecosystem with all of its wetlands and woodlands and so on has a complete capacity to handle rainwater and get that into the groundwater system and so on. The riparian zone doesn't have that capacity. It's what I would call the minimum idea for protecting a stream. Is it sufficient for the kind of riparian area that a stream needs to be functioning in optimum condition? Probably not. At a more specific level, such as local government bylaws, many local governments have development permit areas that intend to protect, say, ecologically sensitive areas within the local government community. But that has to contend with the realities of what happens to drainage from development. If it's a curb and gutter kind of development, that water is going to be discharged somewhere. The impervious surface means that rainfall, some percentage of it does not get back to the ground, does not go back to the stream. So our land use regulations are not tuned to what the riparian setback is about. That's changing, but we have a history of already zoned lands that can be developed on old standards. There's a lot of issues around how technically the legislation can support or fail to support a stream and its ecological condition.
So I'm glad, Manny, you mentioned the importance of First Nations and the indigenous knowledge around some of these watersheds. From a local government perspective, where I've put a lot of time in, it's one of the most important omissions that I see currently emerging around why a piece of legislation, for example, like the Fish Protection Act and the riparian area regulation, because it basically says that a local government can facilitate building permit or projects for development as long as they stay this far from the high water mark or the top of bank. So nowhere does a local government have the ability to look at or take into an account the cultural significance of a particular watershed from a First Nations perspective. So I would agree that I think there would be some important dialogue needed at both the provincial and federal level to begin looking at how these legislation pieces that govern setbacks and corridors and greenways need to really embrace a broader perspective. I'm really interested, Manny, in your you've talked a bit about proposing a new governance model and things like that. So Manny, in terms of what you think you would like to see changed, why don't you look at the ecological process for watershed valuation and worth? And maybe you might have a few questions for Tim in terms of how you might see the ecological accounting process help you move your vision for a new governance model forward.
On that aspect, where the EAP would be helpful to Gibsons as well, would be for us to have a better understanding of the value of the land, as in relation, the EAP is based on assessment data, and we also use that data for taxation purposes, for example. One opportunity perhaps would be to look at the taxation that we impose as local governments, and whether there's an opportunity to recognize those values that we speak of and give us the ability to compensate the landowner for preserving that asset. That's a tool we don't presently have, and I think that it could be helpful for us. And in that sense, that's where the EAP in that scenario would occur. Through the earlier work around the aquifer mapping, what we discovered was that the extent of the aquifer goes well beyond the town of Gibsons, and in that sense we think it's a perfect example to bring in the 10 agencies that I mentioned that operate over that same area, so that we can all work from the asset management plan for that natural asset, including having the protection that needs to go with it. One example that we did there in Gibsons was to enact a development permit guideline and a requirement for the protection of the aquifer, and it was relatively easy for us to implement that regulation over the town's proper boundary, but it's much more difficult to encourage our neighbors to do that, and particularly when they are provincial agencies or federal for that matter.
You talked about the way of incorporating taxation and valuation, and I've had this interesting thought. Is we all know from various purchasing methods that items and assets that are sought by a community that are taxed highly are treated differently. Do you think, Tim, in the EAP there might be an opportunity to look at even some scenarios where you might work with a progressive municipality, say like Gibsons, and look at maybe some modeling that would look at what would the result maybe be if we were, say, taxing harmful behavior to the watersheds and then the resultant cost to the watersheds? Would it be too difficult, or what do you think about that idea?
Well, the definition of harmful behavior would be the first problem. What exactly is that? I think we have some evidence of what harmful behavior can be, but it's different. It's a very different case for, say, a large area versus an individual parcel in a residential zone. And then somebody who's dumping paint in the stream is a pretty obvious harm doer. But a decommissioned road, a road that is, let's say, facilitating erosion and isn't decommissioned, is another kind of story. But a very specific example would be, and this is not about harm specifically, but we're doing some work on Boker Creek in the Capital Regional District, and it flows through Saanich, District of Saanich, City of Victoria, and the District of Oak Bay. Some areas are slated for enhancement, and properties encroach on the stream because of very old development. Sometimes the parcels go right across the stream. Existing buildings are not at the right setback position. So if enhancement takes place and the riparian setbacks are taken out of a latent state and made active, how does the local government deal with a number of property owners who lose some area, potentially, that they can no longer develop? So that's a loss on their value. Their existing buildings are too close to the stream. Does that mean that they would have to be dealt with, or what kind of compensation might take place? So the idea of what's harmful depends on the circumstance, whether it's old development or development after regulation. And the individual challenges will be attached to parcels and the ownership of those parcels, whether it's forest land or agricultural land or residential land and so on. So I don't know if I'm answering your question, but I see a lot of challenges about how you work with the existing legislation and refine it so it can deal with the new challenges.
Maybe I can add to that. We prefer, I think we try to use more of an appreciative inquiry to our response, and rather than sort of penalize or try to sort of pursue those that are doing harm, we see a lot of value in enhancing what we know works well. And I think it's also important that for everything that we're talking about here, the challenges that we have coming at us from a climate change perspective, as an example, is going to require very different thinking that we're applying today. And I don't see how to address the questions of droughts or floods or sea level rise with our current policy is very limited. One way that we're looking at is how to think about is natural asset management is to climate adaptation, what energy management is to climate mitigation. And we're still primarily focused on the mitigation side of things. And I think this is something that we have to bring forward for communities to consider.
Yeah, I agree with Manny. I think the adaptation perspective is a really important one, and it's very early in the stages of how that can be understood and applied.
So we've heard from the two pioneers in the field that while the provincial and federal legislations are present and afford some protection, the field of natural asset management is changing so rapidly and quickly, and is incorporating things like cultural knowledge, social mental health and well-being feelings around being close to these natural assets. So we need to move things in a different direction, and we're fortunate that we've got these two pioneers that are leading some extremely important work in this field. We've heard how both the ecological accounting process and the Municipal Natural Assets Initiative have providing a new way of valuating or quantitatively assessing natural assets, as in they're striving to give a value to these things that were commonly taken for granted. So Tim, the EAP produces values of worth on these watersheds. Tell me how you think these values will be used, or how important are they to the stewardship groups?
The values are derived in the context of the natural commons concept, and by having a value for a stream system, the actual corridor that's occupied, the land that's in the setback zone, we define it as a land use. So by having that definition and a value, it gives the stewardship community an opportunity to argue that ecological services are as important as other land use activities that local governments must deal with. The other part of the value is the worth of investment that's been made by the stewardship community and others in maintenance and management of natural assets. That's overlooked often, and if that number is produced, it starts to put a very positive outlook on what communities are doing to protect their natural assets.
Manny, you've put so much time and effort into the MNAI that you must see something very important that local governments are maybe currently missing or could take from the work you're doing. So explain a little bit about how important you think these kinds of natural asset valuations are to local government.
Well, they're very important, and it's fundamental that they are incorporated into financial planning. Financial planning is part of asset management, and so when you do evaluation, it's within that context to start with. In our case, our numbers were used to plan a capital project, but that led to changes, other financial related changes as well. We were looking at it from the perspective of risk. Part of the reason to do those works was to reduce the likelihood and the severity of flooding events. And so just for that reason alone could be a strong motivation to take action. Also from a climate change planning perspective, it's important. We have both financial reporting and financial planning requirements. So on the side of financial reporting, is it in essence what we report under Public Sector Accounting Board Standard 3150 requires to report on the depreciation of the value of the infrastructure that the municipality owns. The challenge is it's not easy to do that with a natural asset because it's fundamentally different than an engineered asset when it comes to finances. There's no upfront costs, there's no financial depreciation, there's no replacement costs. It has lower operational and capital costs. It can even be carbon neutral or carbon positive. It could last in perpetuity if we maintain it properly, and it offers multiple benefits. For all of those reasons, I'm still surprised that there's communities today that don't manage their natural assets from a financial perspective. But those are the foundation, the primary reasons why we decided to take some initiative there.
So I think both your involvement in the work you're doing has made it quite clear that there's a need to revisit traditional financial planning in terms of looking at natural assets used in green infrastructure. Let's spend a little bit of time and touch on some of these other benefits other than financial planning that you think might benefit or come around from this new way of looking at things. Tim, you've talked around a lot of this perception of worth, and what does that mean? We've heard Manny talk about these other features around well-being and things. So why don't we, you start the discussion, Tim. So other than financial planning, what kinds of benefits might you see the EAP producing for communities?
I think it offers several things. It offers a view really on the use and conservation of land as being equal values, and talked earlier about the social and ecological and financial implications of that. The systems perspective on natural assets is very important. That indicates that it's important not to be concerned only with a particular area where there's an issue or problem, but to understand that in the context of a system and take the measures that are required to deal with risks and opportunities in that context. Local government also is getting a lot of benefit from the work of the stewardship sector, both in terms of their volunteerism, their expertise, and also the fact that they help raise funding to carry out some of this work that's required to appreciate what the natural assets offer in the community.
Manny?
A lot has come since 2016 when we understood the value that we were getting from a small parcel of land within the core of Gibsons. What followed from there was changes to almost every plan that we have, starting with the official community plan. After that, I think there's an important element here, which is for communities to understand the relationship between what they ask developers to build and their ability to maintain it as well. And to that end, we amended our subdivision standards bylaw to more explicitly require the preservation of natural areas and also the development that is more in line with nature as well. Not surprisingly, it changed also our management practices around parks, not just in that area but in other parks as well. It led to changes to our stormwater management plan, because we've moved away from simply conveying water to using a more of a sponge-like approach, and that a lot has come from that plan as well, and motivated us to expand the valuation to the remaining portions of the town, including our natural areas.
So, as the chief executive at the town of Gibsons, I'm going to ask you a different question compared to your chair of the MNAI group. You talked about policy, you've talked about changes in actual stormwater management planning documents and things. I want to ask you, Neil, a little bit about your staff and the staff team at Gibsons. There's no manual to give a new hire and say, we are a green infrastructure community and a natural asset community. So what changes take place at a staffing level, or how do you perpetuate this this new way of looking at amongst the staff at Gibsons?
That was one of our earlier learnings, the realization that these classes of assets, these types of assets, cannot be managed by one department. And like many communities, we were associating a department with an asset, roads and so on. So we moved away from that and introduced the concept of integrated teams to manage these areas, being the foreshore or a park in that matter. The other aspect of it, we recognized that we needed a different type of training. We have nearly very little experience with streamkeeping works. Our ability to respond to an incident that might be occurring with a natural area is much less than we're able to respond to an engineered asset. I think that, so investing in training, and what followed with technology was actually our last option, which allows our staff to view the current condition of these natural areas and contribute to the management of it as well. So the concept of teams and training and technology is where we focused our approach.
Tim, you've talked a lot about the perception of worth as being one of these inherent and primary features to come out of the EAP. Talk a little bit about how or what might be some of the most important teaching or outreach points that would come out of an example, an EAP pilot project. You know, and I guess what I'm getting at is the Brooklyn Creek, for example, the people that you engaged on the Brooklyn Creek will learn and get an understanding of the worth around that work. But what if you wanted to take a lesson or a key message and go somewhere where they're not doing an EAP project? What would you tell them, or what's the key learning point that you would speak to get these other people interested in this perception of worth notion?
If you're referring to a municipality or local government context?
Sure, could be a local government. It could be a watershed coalition from a watershed elsewhere in the province.
I think the first thing is to emphasize that a natural asset provides ecological services that are being used in the community, and they have value, whether this particular group or organization knows that or not, and that there's a way to describe what those are and find their values in terms of what the community is doing. I think to introduce the ecological accounting process to a community that's not involved at all with their natural assets, you would have to, you would have to do what we do, is form an advisory group that represents the government and the stewardship sector and possibly others, who would be leaders, take interest in it, and then want to see it applied. But there's no magic to take it to a community and say, well, this is your solution and you should be doing it.
So we heard Manny mention about one of the first things they changed at Gibson's was going to an integrated planning approach when faced with big decisions. What kind of improvements do you think the EAP could make in integrating more of the community with, say, the local government or the landowner or the decision makers?
Well, like the Municipal Natural Assets Initiative, we're doing a number of cases, and I think the learnings from those cases are the kind of message that would be delivered to a local government to show them the advantages of using, in this case, the ecological accounting process.
Today we've heard from Tim Pringle, chair of the Ecological Accounting Process, and we've heard about the natural commons, the value of natural commons, the perceived worth of the watershed. Tim's explained through a couple of the examples how investing in these natural commons actually can help local governments save money, can produce a better community asset. Manny Machado and the Municipal Natural Asset Inventory Program, where he is also the chair, he's talked about how these natural assets deliver community services that the community relies on. But again, he's also looked at and talked a bit about how he's embedded a philosophy around strategy, policy that looks at each particular decision, and they ask the question, can this service be provided alternatively through a natural process? Can we use green infrastructure for this? So we're going to wrap up now, and I'm going to ask each of you to summarize. Tim, you can go first. In terms of the ecological accounting process, what's the next big move or the next really large challenge or goal that you have for the program you're involved with?
Let me start by saying that I'm very impressed with the work that the stewardship and conservation community does. Quite a lot of expertise and amazing volunteerism. And I recognize there's a difference. The conservation organizations acquire sites, natural sites, maintain and protect them. The stewardship sector works in the community where the ecological services are. They apply their expertise. They're great fundraisers. They're great collaborators to carry out the maintenance and management that may be needed for an asset such as a stream. So some of the ways I think the ecological accounting process can assist the stewardship sector, there are several. One is that EAP defines the stream corridor and the setback area as a land use. It can be measured, it's defined in legislation. When you look at it from that point of view, it implies that the stewardship sector is involved in improving or influencing land use and how it affects streams and natural assets. EAP also provides some definitions or concepts that are very important, starting with the idea, the concept of the natural commons, which is the area that the community shares and has access to use or enjoy ecological services. Second concept is the package of ecological services, which are the many ways in which a natural asset can support the community, residents and property owners. Some of those services are used to support municipal infrastructure. Also, the ecological accounting process calculates the worth of a stream, and that's the investment that the community has made over time, say a decade or more, in protecting and managing a stream. Often those numbers aren't calculated or tabulated. Having them gives the community an opportunity to realize that we have this asset, we are investing in it. If we know the value of it, we would know how much perhaps to spend annually to maintain and manage it. To get that asset value, EAP looks at the setback area, that is the regulated zone along the stream, plus the stream corridor itself, calculates the area, uses BC assessment data to reach a value for the setback zone, and that can be used then in preliminary budgeting processes and planning processes. So I think I would just wrap up by saying that the stewardship community does an amazing job, and I think they are the players that are mission-driven, work on the site, on the asset. They support the local government, and unfortunately local government is a responsive organization. They react when there's proposals for development or subdivision, and they try to regulate what happens in that process. So they need the front runners, the stewardship community, to make it possible to adequately maintain and manage our streams. So I'm all for the stewardship sector buying into the idea that conservation and use of land are equal values.
Manny?
For us, it all started with the question of trying to understand our dependency on nature to provide these services to our residents, and finding out the obvious that we're highly dependent on them to continue to operate as a municipality. We're also motivated by a different question, was around understanding our risk exposure. And the question was, can we actually afford not to maintain these assets? If we're relying on nature and to provide these services, what is the level of comfort that we're prepared to live in and live with? In our case, we have gone systematically through our natural assets to answer some of those questions. And I think it's wise to follow the advice of the Insurance Bureau of Canada that in essence their rule of thumb is keep the natural assets that you have, restore what you have lost, and build only what you can. Ultimately, our goal is to have infrastructure that is the most natural, the most energy efficient, the most reliable, and that it costs the taxpayer the least over the long term. And to meet that goal, I would say it's nearly impossible without introducing the management of natural assets to a municipality.
Thank you both for joining us today with this discussion. It's been very enlightening.
Thank you. Thanks, Tim.
Today we heard about the EAP and MNAI processes and how they help local government understand, value, and sustain healthy watersheds, and the vital role of stewardship groups in our water balance future. Next week, we will hear of national and international alignment with the need to protect, bolster, and restore water balance and ecological functioning in the International Year of the Salmon.
The takeaway message for the video trilogy series is one of hope. We humans are part of nature. We are part of the ecosystem. We have a big effect because there are so many of us. We change the landscape and we change it profoundly, but we are still part of it. How do we encapsulate the human element? It is not just our impact on things, it is much more. It is our behavior. It is how our behavior has changed over the decades. The purpose of a video trilogy series is to show how many of us are striving to make things better in British Columbia.
In a nutshell, choose to have cumulative benefits, not cumulative impacts, one property at a time.
Well, good morning, Manny, Tim.
Good morning.
So that, again, similar to the first video, I chose not to watch the thing in its entirety. So today was the first time I've seen it. And I really have to congratulate both of you on really what an outstanding job you did, because looking back now, it was so long ago that we did the filming. I wasn't easy on the both of you with the kinds of questions and things that I was asking. So, but again, you both did really well, remarkable. So we'll get a few questions from the audience and from our viewers coming in, but we'll start off the discussion a little bit. And I want to start, Manny, with a general question for you around what is a natural asset in terms of a traditional civic piece of infrastructure, and explain to some of the, many of our viewers are stakeholders, and they may still not grasp kind of what it is we're grasping at. So maybe give us an example of a traditional piece of municipal infrastructure and describe a little bit about how you might look at it through an ecosystem service lens.
Certainly, can give you a couple of examples. Well, first of all, good morning if I haven't said that yet, and good to see you again. So for us, like a lot of municipalities, let's take our water system. We primarily on the books and in our operations, our work started at the pump house going forward into the distribution system and so on. So we certainly have a detailed analysis of where every pipe is and every valve in every building. It never really occurred to us that, we need to think about where that water comes from as well until we really got into the aquifer work, realizing that the water system, it's also includes the body of water, whether it's underground or on the surface, that holds that water, and that even if it sits, like in our case, outside of our jurisdiction, we now include that. So we moved away from a nearly 100% engineered system to a blended model, and that just recognizes reality on the ground. The same happens with our stormwater management system. On paper, our list of assets, and before the policy change, included all the culverts and curb and gutters and so on, catch basins, but we have a lot of natural drainage ditches, we have forests, we have ponds, and those services were just there and taken for granted until then. So that's two examples of where now when we talk about our infrastructure system, we just include both. They don't make that differentiation, because communities sometimes hear about, they're busy managing infrastructure and then, they wish they had time to do natural asset management. Well, it's not either or, it's all the same. And it's just that progression. And in our case, it's been relatively good fits to incorporate.
Okay. I want to just second part question to you, Manny. Gibson's, I understand, has implemented some operations and management protocols and practices of specific natural assets. Can you briefly describe a little bit about those specific operations, management practices, and how you work them into the financial planning?
Certainly. So if we go up to White Tower Park, that park was sort of quietly working, doing some storm work, but primarily we treat it as a connection corridor with a series of trails, with some forested areas, was in simple terms, a park. And we ourselves had three divisions, so three departments that came and went to that site, did their work without necessarily talking to each other or being aware of each other's work. And so, Parks does the bulk of the work there and did. And, remember a few years back, they freshly planted new native species around the ponds, and that engineer shows up with a project to dredge those ponds. And, we had to sort of do that work twice, trample over the same area we just planted. And so that's a small example of what happens a lot in our business, and hopefully it doesn't happen too often anymore. But what that told us, out of that valuation come a best management practice guide that we, in essence, needed to do that. Sort of, we have one park, and everybody that comes and goes to that site with a specific function is now based on the work associated with the updated management plan for that area. And the same can be said for the foreshore area, where we've got a major trunk line, sewer line, but it is everybody's responsibility, and we manage more unifiedly than otherwise.
Thanks, Manny. Now, okay, I'm going to shift directions a little bit. We've had a couple of inquiries sort of from the viewers, Tim, around this term you use, natural commons. I know here in North Van, we've actually worked with you on an EAP project here. And the term was new to me when we first started working on it. So describe to me a little bit more about, what do you mean by natural commons, maybe an example or two, and then why does the EAP use this term and how important is it?
I'll try to be brief because you may have a lot of questions. We use the term natural commons because these are facilities, natural or constructed in our communities, that everyone residents and property owners have access to and can use and enjoy. So that includes on the constructed common side, roads, drainage systems, potable water systems, and so on. On the natural commons side, it's features that are in our landscapes and frequently enjoyed either aesthetically or for practical ecological services. So a stream is the kind of commons that we focus on with the ecological accounting process, because streams connect the watershed to the built community, as it were. And as a natural commons, people are able to see the comparison of a stream as a service that everyone can access and enjoy in the same way that maybe they enjoy a road or a school or a park. So we use that concept to try to make the comprehension of what we enjoy in our community on the constructed side and the natural side as being equally important.
Okay, thanks, Tim. So I've got a couple quick follow-up questions on the EAP. Does the municipality or local government, do they need to have ownership or control of the land for an EAP process on a watershed to be of value?
Not necessarily. For example, we're doing work on the Millstone River, which is in the regional district of Nanaimo in the city of Nanaimo. The city of Nanaimo for 20 years has been pursuing a greenway project that now extends from the harbor to their boundary with the regional district. And over the years, they've acquired sites. They have entered into agreements with Ducks Unlimited regarding part of the Buttertubs Marsh area, also with Nature Trust of BC. So there's a lot of collaborations, and it isn't necessarily ownership. It includes a management agreement that could include covenants and so on. The strength of doing that, I would say, is more about understanding and dealing with the stream as a system rather than the specific parts of the stream, which may be purchase sites or parks or whatever. It's all important, but I think the system concept is what allows a strategy to be robust, and the various works that go on over the years to be successful.
I can add a bit to that, Richard.
Sure.
So we hear that a lot ourselves, just in terms of the land is outside of the town, or it's in private land and so on. We've actually have done some work to the Natural Assets Initiative, produced a guide a couple of years ago to give some direction or some support there. But in our experience, it hasn't stopped, or it shouldn't really be a showstopper, the form of tenure that it's available, because we've got at our disposal things like land acquisition, for example, where possible. There are land use options like OCP or zoning or development permit guidelines that can be forms of securing those sites. There are economic instruments like payments for ecosystem services that are having some success in Canada, limited, it's quite practiced in Europe. There are regulations as well that we can apply, and certification programs or partnerships, other forms of tenure that are options for local governments and others to deal with property that are not under the ownership and control of the town itself.
I guess, I know, Manny, in part of the interview, you talked about that cubic meter of water coming from Mount Elphinstone and making it all its way down, and the number of different jurisdictions that cubic meter was influenced by. And I guess that's something, this light just went on for me, Tim, and that's the importance of establishing this natural commons, right? Rather than worrying too much about individual boundaries. And we heard from the video session last week, the importance of collaboration towards success on our common vision. And I guess, Tim, that's these natural commons is ownership doesn't really matter. These natural areas and natural commons are important to everyone within the watershed. And I think that's what you just kind of mentioned and highlighted, Manny. So Manny, I'm gonna shift more into kind of some local government unique things that I see that Gibson's been involved with. There's a couple things that I'd like you to comment on. You mentioned within Gibson's, nature is our most valuable asset. And I understand that you've actually had statements from your accounting and finance people embedded into a lot of your reporting and your documents. And then the other thing I want you to comment a little bit about, somewhere you mentioned the title Chief Resiliency Officer. I've not heard of that title before. Is it something new? And is it something that was created as a result of this work you're doing on natural assets? Give us a bit of insight.
Certainly. On the first part, the notes on financial statements, when we were discussing with our auditor at the time in 2014, whether we should be, now that we have this understanding about the value of this aquifer, not in financial terms yet, but in terms of a dependency, there was a presentation earlier that day to council to sort of highlight a change in the accounting standards that require municipalities and others to report on any future liabilities, for example, particularly coming out of contaminated sites. And in that context, if we have a dependency on an asset of this size and value, and should we be reporting publicly that we depend on that, and that it implies a higher degree of care in our part? And the discussion, sort of originally started around, making financial statement or environmental statements in a financial document, but ultimately we were talking about risk management. And so we ended up with a note that in essence said, the town recognizes nature is the most valuable asset, and despite the limitations in the accounting standards, it nevertheless recognizes that value and is taking action towards that. Later on, after the valuation on White Tower Park, we ended up with an improved asset that, technically we weren't allowed to report, which kind of a little bit odd. But so that second note essentially says that the town has natural assets, but one in particular, these ponds, have a value of services in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. And so that's what that note says. Ultimately, we will see in some form, the town led the submission to the Accounting Standards Board late in 2018 with organizations across Canada, including the Ecofiscal Commission and others. And that provided some recommendations to amend accounting standards for cities and others that would more rigorously report on the value of the services that we get and the associated risks or otherwise. So in terms of the Chief Resiliency Officer part, it came out of sort of dealing with COVID in particular, and the need to deal with climate change. And we've been trying to, it's not about me, it's about the position in the town, and that centralizing a little bit more within our team, the coordination of all the actions that we have to do in terms of our resiliency planning. We've identified 6 different areas and up to 30 different action items that we could work. And in order to coordinate, we created this dashboard. In essence, council also recognized that there's value in enhancing the capacity we have internally. And so the job title got changed, and it refers to strategic planning, climate change planning, risk management, and emergency planning as sort of a blended practice that is, in essence, my second hat. But to me, it's all the same hat. It's just a note from council to recognize that climate change is our most important challenge ahead, and that's what we work on pretty much every day.
Thanks, Emmanuel. So we're starting to get some feedback from some of the people online watching us. So I'm going to just go to the board here, as they say, with some questions that are coming up. So these are, I recognize that these are coming at you cold, but some of them, some very, very good questions. So Tim, we've got a question here around the ecological accounting process and valuing some of these natural assets, such as groundwater and flow in streams and channels. Has there been a thought of incorporating these features in this valuation process in terms of emergency management, or say risk management, and or say to help in the prevention of, say, natural risk factors like flooding or things like that?
Well, part of the research that the ecological accounting process does is to look at the hydrology of a creek shed or a watershed. And a few principles we found are: the healthier the riparian ecosystem and the riparian environment, the more capacity the watershed has to support water pathways, the natural water pathways. So that's intercept rainfall, be able to infiltrate it, detain it, gradually release it to groundwater, and in that process also supply streams in the drier parts of the year. So that speaks to attenuation of potential flooding. The healthier the riparian zone in an agricultural area, say a floodplain area like the Millstone, very active riparian zone with the right vegetation will help dry out the land after the spring freshet more quickly than if there were no riparian area there. So there's a lot of levels to this, but I would say primarily healthy ecosystem, riparian ecosystem will help manage water pathways, which is valuable for a number of municipal concerns.
Again, it's a good point, and it's interesting to consider around, not just the valuation of the natural assets in the commons areas, but in preventing risk and hazard to the communities as well, right? Manny, we've got a question here that I'm going to give to you here regarding sort of interdepartmental integration and sharing of knowledge and duties in say a typical government or bureaucratic setting. Someone has asked here about any tips you might have on the whole corporation-wide integration needed to develop this sort of natural asset thinking.
So in our case, we've got been developing specific terms of reference for these teams. We try to run a relatively flat organization, myself included, and that. So I take part in the team like everyone else. We've got an asset management team, which was our first team, and again, Asset Management BC got a lot of support from them in that sense, and it's the value of working together in that as they recommend, and we have been practicing that. The work on eco asset strategy came from assembling that team, because expecting that to happen simply coming from either one of our departments, it probably wouldn't have happened, I would suggest. We have a risk management team as well that deals with legal and other types of risk policies and insurance and other types of questions. A very important team that we have is the resource management. It's not, again, one of those department specific, and we've got communications and by law enforcement, for example. We've got operations folks, but also finance, because there's tremendous opportunity in that area as well. And our fourth team is planning and development, and its integration of the policies and the approach, so that when you engage with a town of Gibsons, there's only one town. There's not a department or a series of departments, and And so we try to speak with one voice and operate as unifiedly as we can. And we've been making changes over time to the specific department integration. We brought in a manager of operations a few years ago, and it's been very, very helpful in terms of maximizing. We've got not enough time and not enough staff to do all the things we need to do. And so when it's entering into teams also helps you to be more efficient, we find from that perspective. So those are the types of things that we've been trying to do from that perspective.
So Emanuel, you mentioned an asset management team. Briefly describe the various members of the town of Gibson staff that provide important and regular contribution to the asset management team. Who are they?
There are planning, infrastructure, finance, and administration. And we'll switch those around if we have to. So within the team structure, a former department per se would lead that team, and sometimes we do take turns of that. Every couple of years we switch. But that's in general how it works. And because asset management, it's everybody's business. And in the process of planning our assets, there's different interventions at different times. And it's not a question of just giving it to finance to report out on the inventories and give it to engineering to operate it. It's a lot more complex than that.
That I agree. Again, every time I talk to you, I get a new little quote or something, right? Asset management is everyone's business in local government. I really like that. So an integrated team, planning and infrastructure and engineering, great news. I know you talk to a lot of people in a lot of different local governments around learning and trying to find out what's going on there. We've had another question around what are a few other municipalities that you've come across that appear to be doing some interesting things along the same line?
Across Canada, you're seeing great examples, and even if our language is slightly different as we travel across the different provinces, from the Yukon to Newfoundland, I'm not aware of any province that there isn't action. In BC, Nanaimo, the Comox Valley as well, West Vancouver have been doing quite a bit of work and very solid work. We've got Grand Forks example. They had a tremendous challenge with funding and still do, and have quite the undertaking, and they are benefiting from an integrated watershed management structure for their response. We've done quite a bit of work in Alberta, right from the city of Edmonton and down to Okotoks as well. In Ontario, large regions, we've worked with the region of Peel. They've got in the neighborhood of 37 watersheds, and within that sort of heavily urbanized area as well, the town of Oakville, and another one escapes me now. And then out in New Brunswick, we've got 3 other different pilots within their service regions, east and west as well. So I've seen quite a bit of that.
Okay, thanks. Tim, I've got a question that's going to build on some of the dialogue we had earlier. What suggestions would you have for both local governments and stakeholders, especially stakeholder groups that are very active in restorative efforts? I know when we went through an EAP project, and you mentioned it in some of your dialogue, it's really hard to find records, details, and costs to quantify the efforts being done by the stakeholder groups, right? So kind of in 2 parts, what suggestions would you have for a local government in terms of how to better collect and manage this information? And then what advice might you give to some of the stakeholder groups that do so much volunteer work in terms of trying to ensure that the work they're putting into these watersheds is somehow documented?
I think Manny mentioned in the case of Gibson's having teams that are dealing with the asset management work that's required. And I see that being done. That was the case in Brooklyn Creek with the town of Comox. That's the case in the work we're doing regarding the Millstone River. So the operating departments at the city of Nanaimo, they share a strategy regarding the Millstone and the greenway development along the stream, as well as protection of certain conservation areas. And in the regional district, it's the Drinking Water Watershed Protection Program that is a team that involves not just municipal figures, but also community organizations. Their research and citizen science work is all about team participation, very strong. It's been developed over 10 years, and that program is now going into its second decade of this kind of work. And I see emphasis in their next decade on enlarging the community involvement in their teams, carry out the work they feel is important to understand the water region, the millstone in that water region, monitoring the health of the stream, identifying those enhancements that will give the most return to protect the stream, but also I would say enhance the ecological services that are being enjoyed by the community. What was the second part of your question?
Advice to the stakeholder groups, right? Like the stakeholder groups go out thousands of hours in every community every year that virtually goes undocumented.
Yeah, that is a tough one. I think the kind of reporting is important. I know it's sometimes drudgery to have to try to get those details together and report them back to your own organization and the collaborators you're involved with. But we don't have that information. We're forgetting the nuances of how we manage the asset. For me, an analogy would be, if you want to get 5% return on your investment, you need to pay attention to where it's invested and is it stocks, bonds, whatever. And it's the same in the work that the stewardship groups are doing. If they want to get a good return on their investment, they need to find the nuances of communicating, reporting back, and the quality of the collaborations in which they're working.
A comment, if I can, to that, yeah. Richard. Two areas we've launched last week a project called the Source to Sea project, and is a full evaluation of the Gibson's watershed. We're engaging with some local conservation folks as well, and I think the area of data collection and ongoing monitoring are two areas that, even though it's happening somewhat informally or uninformally, we would like to see that going forward more structured, because we're interested, like we collect information to understand the value of the asset. You won't need to understand what resources are being input, including human resources. And these assets, as I mentioned earlier, are actually seen to be increasing in value. So that work even becomes even more important. But we haven't been documenting that, but we certainly, out of our Source to Sea project, intend to see that as a practice that we'll incorporate into our agreement with our citizen science partners going forward.
Great. So we're getting close to noon. I don't want to keep you too much longer. We just got a few more that I'd like to touch on here. We've had a couple of questions on a similar theme around, you know, does the general public know about, you know, what would the cost be if all of our natural services were removed and being replaced with just gray infrastructure? And you know, it's an interesting question, but again, it speaks a little bit to sort of the glass being empty or almost empty kind of thing. And so take your turns, both of you, and we'll start with you, Tim. Explain a little bit to why it's not that critical. I believe everyone can intuitively recognize the things that green infrastructure does for us, like provide water and the values that trees provide. But why is it important to focus on the things that we can do going forward?
It struck me in the work we're doing regarding the millstone. The economy of the Nanaimo region has changed over the last 40 years from resource-oriented, service-oriented economy. There's a lot of in-migration, the people that come to the community, and this might be similar for Gibson's, they're coming for the range of services they see and the quality of life that they think they will find in that location. And the natural assets have a lot to do with that perception, whether it's the sea coast or the streams or the forest lands and so on. There are some principles that we've discovered that tell us what happens when you have gray rather than green. There are streams that aren't even observable to the community. They don't know they're there because they're in culverts, they're buried. That's why the Boker Creek Blueprint Initiative has, now in its second decade, has a community buy-in and local government buy-in to daylighting the stream, bringing back the ecological services. The community wants to access the ecological services. Those services are not individually enjoyed only, they're also, as you mentioned earlier in your comments, they're about health, they're about well-being. They attract visitors, they attract new residents. So we're talking about the natural assets as being part of the economy and being perceived more positively or more knowledgeably by communities that are finding that they're attracting migrants, retirees, and so on to enjoy the quality of life and have access dependably to potable water, places to walk, places to recreate, and so on. It's all of that.
Manny?
For us on the values, we're talking about our first valuation was trying to understand the value in relation to an equivalent or near equivalent from a service provision engineered option. But it's important, without understanding that value, it's hard to instill a commitment to preserve it. That's the essence of taking it for granted, I guess. But there's also real risk of not understanding that dependency and what you would be exposed financially and otherwise should an asset fail. And to that end, we're terribly unprepared as a nation, as in a region for that matter, because of that dependency that we have. And that is, as strong of a commitment I think that we can make to go forward. Is for those types of reasons. It's we're in working with our financial, we're just refining those numbers a little bit more, and it's not even so much about the number in the end as it is about the understanding that we're committed to going forward, working even more on those areas.
Right. Okay, I see now we're just afternoon. I got one quick technical question. One of viewers has asked about the use of LiDAR. I know you mentioned it, Manny. I know we've made extensive use of LiDAR here at North Van District. They're talking about the use of LiDAR as a tool for helping inform, say, stormwater utilities based on tree canopy coverage, and whether that would be an appropriate method or tool. Do you have any comments on that?
Yes, so the LiDAR, that foundational, highly detailed information of the lay of the land per se, with that type of information, you can then make relatively accurate determinations around your tree canopy, for example, and the intensity of that. Obviously, you'll need more detailed work on the ground to verify a lot of that, but you get a good sense of what is that type of density. For us, LiDAR is also helpful in the work for the aquifer. It's helpful for the coastal valuations part of it. And that type of foundational information is also what we're using. We're creating a computer model, a predictive model that as a foundation LiDAR, and then it embeds some of the economic and social data that we have, and we're able to determine, predetermined questions about understanding the relationship between public health and tree canopy and so on, exposures to climate change, and plan accordingly. But also we'll understand the immersion that comes from what we don't know that we don't know when we do or don't do particular actions, what happens there. And a lot of that work cannot be done without LiDAR. The province has been mapping LiDAR sort of from 10,000 feet. And cities can benefit from that as well. So that's very helpful, particularly as we hopefully move to a watershed scale. And that's a very strong starting point and a valid piece of information. Before LiDAR and before this type of information, it was looking at maps and driving to the site if you could. And now we're able to see and make decisions from afar in that sense. So I'm excited about those types of tools coming in because we're clearly going to be needing them.
Great. Very interesting to hear about the province kind of stepping up and making some LiDAR available to local governments who may not have the expertise or the ability to not only just collect the data, but interpret it, get the image and get the data extrapolated in a way they can make use of, but then importantly, to get repeating cycles of data so that they can actually look and detect change. So that was some good information. So we're going to wrap things up here, and I'm going to wrap things up with just a very quick story that I think you're both going to be quite pleased and happy to hear about, because what it speaks to the reason the two of you, I think, are doing what you're doing is to not only make the areas where you live and work better, but to inspire things within others. So I got a package with a letter from one of our last week's viewers, and it was this from the regional district of Okanagan-Smilkameen. And I'm having a quick look. So again, I want to thank the viewer for sending me this. I had a quick look through here, and the two of you are going to be just quite happy to see that the message is spreading, right? In this book they've produced, which is a climate change resiliency for homeowners book. And in the book, they talk about a First Nations program. And again, I got to apologize if I will likely mispronounce the names and all. The Silex Nation in the Okanagan area has recognized one of the ways to contribute to the Okanagan's water supply issues. Probably many of our viewers are aware of the Okanagan is facing some really important water supply issues going forward, mainly to do with the change in climate and their water supply and snowpack and all of that. But the Silex people have identified the need for a project to restore the mountain beaver habitat into some of the hillland areas, because they've recognized forever the importance this wildlife has in creating wetlands, which store water for supply and clean the water, which then makes more and better quality water available. And they see this now as a project going forward to actually help with their water supply. So from a natural asset management, Manny, I think you can see all kinds of positive things with that idea. Tim, imagine the ability to look at the watersheds where, pre and post mountain beaver restoration work and the creation of wetlands. I think you would agree that there would be a quantitative positive change in the valuations through the AP in looking at these watersheds sort of before the work and after the work. So gentlemen, as always, it's been inspiring to listen and chat with you. You both have just done an incredible job in pulling this together. Thank you for all your efforts, and I thank our viewers and the production team for all of your work. Thanks again. Good day, everyone. It's been great chatting.
Yes, thank you, Richard. Thanks, Tim.
Thanks,
And,
Richard.
the rest
Thanks,
of the
Manny.
team. Much appreciated. Keep well.
Good day.
Bye-bye.